In a small, quiet town in upstate New York, life moved at its own slow pace. The streets were lined with old brick buildings and cozy family-owned shops. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect big scandals or dangerous secrets. But beneath the surface of this sleepy little community, something ugly was brewing, something that would shake the town to its core. At the center of it all was a young detective who had dedicated her life to protecting people. She wasn't flashy or loud. She just believed deeply in doing what was right. For years she worked hard, solving cases and earning respect from those around her. What no one knew, though, was that she carried a secret, a big one. Her father was the director of the FBI, a powerful man whose name commanded attention across the country. But she never mentioned him at work. She didn't want anyone thinking she got special treatment because of who her dad was. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet. Her job wasn't easy, especially since the department she worked for had some serious problems. Over time, she started noticing strange things happening. Files went missing. Evidence disappeared. Officers acted suspiciously, whispering in corners when they thought no one was listening. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. So she decided to dig deeper. It didn't take long before she uncovered a shocking truth. 2 high-ranking officers in the department were involved in illegal activities. They weren't just bending the rules, they were breaking them completely. These men ran a dirty operation behind closed doors, smuggling drugs and laundering money. They used their badges as shields, hiding behind the law while breaking it themselves. Worst of all, they bullied anyone who dared to speak out against them. People who tried to report them either vanished or suddenly changed their stories under pressure. The detective knew she had to do something, but she also knew how risky it would be. These officers weren't ordinary criminals. They had connections everywhere. Still, she refused to back down. Day by day, she gathered evidence. Late nights turned into early mornings as she pieced together clues, chasing leads that others ignored. Finally, after months of careful investigation, she caught a break. One night, while following one of the officers to what she suspected was a secret meeting, she managed to record a conversation. Their voices were clear, discussing plans for another shipment of drugs and how much money they stood to make. It was proof, solid, undeniable proof, that could bring them down. But here's the thing about corruption. It doesn't exist alone. When she handed over the evidence to Internal Affairs, hoping they'd step in and handle it, she quickly realized she'd made a mistake. Instead of helping, Internal Affairs seemed more interested in covering everything up. Before she knew it, the tables had turned. Suddenly, she was the one being accused of wrongdoing. Someone had twisted the facts, claiming she planted fake evidence to ruin the reputations of good officers. The same system she trusted to protect justice had betrayed her. And so the trial began. Sitting in the courtroom, she felt like the walls were closing in. Every glance from the jury, every word, spoken by the prosecutor, felt like another nail in her coffin. Meanwhile, the 2 officers sat smugly in their seats, grinning like they'd already won. They leaned back confidently, chatting casually as if nothing could touch them. Outside the courthouse, reporters snapped photos and asked questions, eager to capture the drama unfolding inside. To everyone else, it looked like an open and shut case. A rogue cop trying to play hero, only to get caught red-handed. But deep down, the detective knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one card left to play, one piece of information she hadn't revealed. As the trial dragged on and the odds stacked higher against her, she clutched onto hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn the tide. After all, she had spent her entire career fighting for justice. This battle might be tougher than most, but she wasn't ready to give up, not when the truth was on her side. Little did anyone know, the real story was far from finished. The trial was dragging on, and the atmosphere in the courtroom felt heavier with each passing day. The detective sat quietly at the defense table, her mind racing as the prosecutor painted her as some kind of rogue cop out for revenge. Witnesses, who had once promised to testify against the corrupt officers, either disappeared or changed their stories under mysterious circumstances. It was clear that someone powerful was pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure the case went their way. Every time the opposing lawyer stood up to speak, his words dripped with confidence. He portrayed her as unstable, reckless, and desperate. A woman trying to destroy two honorable officers because she couldn't handle the truth about her own failures. The jury frowned, scribbling notes, while the judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. She could feel the tide turning against her bit by bit, and yet, despite the mounting pressure, she refused to give up. Something inside her kept pushing forward, telling her there was still a chance to set things right. During a recess on the third day of the trial, she stepped outside the courthouse to catch her breath. The air was cool, but her hands trembled. As she pulled out her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't dialed in months. Hesitating for just a moment, she pressed call. On the other end, the line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" The tone was calm but firm, the kind of voice that commanded respect without needing to try too hard. "It's me," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "What happened?" She took a deep breath, then began explaining everything, the corruption, the threats, the betrayal by internal affairs. She told him how they had twisted her investigation, framing her for crimes she didn't commit. As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She needed to stay strong, even if only for a little longer. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. Then finally he spoke. His voice was steady, reassuring. "Listen carefully," he said. "You're not alone in this. I'll send backup immediately, but don't reveal who I am unless you absolutely have to. Let them underestimate you. Sometimes being underestimated is your greatest advantage." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." After hanging up, she stood there for a moment, clutching the phone tightly. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Her father wasn't just anyone, he was the director of the FBI. If anyone could cut through the tangled web of lies these officers had spun, it was him, but she also knew better than to rely solely on his title. This fight was hers, and she had to finish it herself. Back inside the courtroom, the mood shifted subtly. The two officers, let's call them Officer A and Officer B, were practically glowing with triumph. During breaks, they strolled confidently outside, laughing and joking like old friends. Reporters swarmed around them, eager for sound bites. They played the part perfectly, acting like victims caught in a whirlwind of false accusations. One of them even popped open a bottle of champagne, raising it high as cameras clicked wildly. "She's finished," Officer A declared loudly, pointing toward the courthouse doors. "This whole thing will be over by tomorrow." The next morning, the courtroom felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken sense that something big was about to happen. The detective walked in with her head held high, though her heart was pounding. She had spent the night going over every detail of her plan, rehearsing what she would say and how she would say it. This was her last shot, and she wasn't going to let fear get in the way. As the trial resumed, the prosecutor called yet another witness, a man who claimed he saw the detective tampering with evidence. His story sounded rehearsed, almost robotic, like someone had coached him on exactly what to say. The jury leaned forward, hanging onto his every word. It was clear they were starting to believe the lie being spun around them. But the detective didn't flinch. Instead, she waited patiently for her moment. When the prosecutor finally finished questioning the witness, the judge turned to the defense table. "Does the defendant have any questions for this witness?" he asked, his tone neutral. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. For a second, the entire room went silent. Everyone stared at her, wondering what she was about to do. Even the two officers, who until now had been smirking confidently, looked uneasy. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Before I question this witness, I'd like to present new evidence that directly relates to my innocence and exposes the truth about what's really been happening in this department." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to see what she was talking about. The prosecutor, jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't given prior notice of any new evidence." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Overruled," he said firmly. "Proceed." With that, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. "Holding it up for everyone to see," she explained. "This contains surveillance footage proving beyond a doubt that I'm innocent, and that these two officers are guilty of corruption." She handed the drive to the bailiff, who passed it along to the judge. The two officers exchanged panicked glances. Their smirks vanished, replaced by looks of sheer terror. They whispered furiously to their lawyers, but it was too late. Whatever game they thought they were winning was slipping through their fingers. As the footage played on a screen set up in the courtroom, the truth came spilling out. Grainy but undeniable images showed the officers meeting in secret, counting stacks of cash and discussing plans to smuggle drugs. Their voices were clear, their faces unmistakable. One clip even captured them threatening a junior officer who had dared to ask questions about their activities. The room fell deathly silent as the reality sank in, but the detective wasn't done yet. As the video ended, she turned to face the judge, then the jury, and finally the two officers themselves. Taking a deep breath, she delivered the line she'd been saving for this exact moment. "And just so we're clear," she said, her voice ringing out loud and strong, "my last name isn't some random coincidence. My father is the director of the FBI." For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled to their feet, shouting questions and reaching for their phones. Cameras flashed wildly as people tried to capture the moment. The two officers looked like deer caught, in headlights, their earlier bravado crumbling into dust. Their lawyer stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Even the judge seemed stunned. He banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "Quiet, quiet in the courtroom," he bellowed, but it took several minutes for the noise to die down. By the time things settled, the mood had shifted completely. The jury members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rethinking everything they'd heard so far. The prosecutor looked pale, his confidence shattered. And the two officers? They slumped in their seats, defeated, knowing their game was up. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees, desperate for comments. Some shouted questions at the detective, asking if she planned to join the FBI now that her family connection was public knowledge. Others tried to corner the two officers, who pushed past them without saying a word. The whole scene was chaotic, electric, and utterly surreal. Back inside, the judge ordered a recess to review the new evidence. As the courtroom emptied, the detective sat alone at the defense table, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't the end, not yet. There would still be more battles to fight, more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small smile. She had done what she set out to do, expose the truth no matter the cost. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a spark of pride, not for revealing her father's identity, but for standing up for what was right. If there was one thing she'd learned through all of this, it was that justice might take time, but it always finds its way. The news of the detective's bombshell revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours, it wasn't just a local story. It was national headlines. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, desperate for updates. News anchors talked about nothing else on television. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags, and debates. People couldn't stop discussing the young cop who had taken on corruption in her own department and revealed she was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in law enforcement. For Officer A and Officer B, life turned into a nightmare, overnight. Their faces were plastered across newspapers and TV screens, accompanied by accusations they could no longer hide from. Friends and colleagues who once laughed with them now avoided eye contact. Even their families seemed to distance, themselves embarrassed by the scandal. The two men tried to act like nothing was wrong, but their confidence was gone. Every knock at the door made them jump. Every phone call felt like a threat. Meanwhile, the detective's father, the FBI director, didn't waste any time. He arrived, in town personally, leading a team of federal agents to dig deeper into the corruption case. His presence sent shockwaves through the community. No one dared to interfere or cover anything up, not with him watching. Local authorities scrambled to cooperate, knowing full well that resistance would only make things worse. For the first time in years, people started to believe real change might actually happen. In a rare public statement, the FBI director praised his daughter's courage. Standing in front of cameras outside the courthouse, he didn't mince words. "What my daughter has done takes immense bravery," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "She risked everything to expose the truth, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. I am proud of her, not because she's my child, but because she's proven herself to be a true champion of justice." His words resonated deeply with the public. People admired the detective even more after hearing how much she had sacrificed. But behind closed doors, the tension between father and daughter remained palpable. Their relationship had always been complicated. Growing up, she often felt overshadowed by his demanding career. He missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones, all in the name of duty. She loved him, but there was always a quiet ache, a longing for the kind of connection they never quite managed to build. Now, sitting together late one evening in a small hotel room near the courthouse, they finally faced each other honestly. The air was heavy with unspoken emotions. She stared at the floor, unsure of where to start. Finally, he broke the silence. "I should have been there for you more," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. "I let work consume me, and I failed you as a father. I'm sorry." She looked up, surprised by his vulnerability. For so long, she'd seen him as untouchable, a figurehead of power and authority. But in that moment, he was just a man, a dad trying to make amends. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "It's not your fault," she replied quietly. "You did what you thought was best, and maybe this is our chance to fix things." He nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. For the first time in years, they felt like a real family again. Back in the town, change was already beginning to take root. New leadership was brought in to clean up the police department. Officers who had stayed silent out of fear finally found the courage to speak up. Community members organized meetings to discuss reforms and rebuild trust between the police and the people they served. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but there was hope. A fragile, flickering light that refused to go out. For the detective, though, the journey was far from over. While she had cleared her name and exposed the corruption, she wasn't ready to return to the force just yet. Too much had happened, and too many wounds needed time to heal. Instead, she threw herself into advocacy work, partnering with organizations focused on police reform. She traveled to conferences, sharing her story and pushing for systemic changes that would prevent others from suffering the way she had. Her speeches became legendary. She spoke with raw honesty, admitting her fears, her doubts, and her mistakes. She talked about the toll the ordeal had taken on her mental health and how close she came to giving up. But she also spoke about resilience, the strength she found within herself when everything seemed lost. Audiences listened intently, hanging on to every word. Many left inspired, determined to fight for justice in their own communities. Through it all, the bond between her and her father continued to grow, stronger. They worked side by side, using their combined influence to push for accountability and transparency in law enforcement. Together, they became a symbol of what could be achieved when integrity and determination joined forces. As weeks turned into months, the town slowly began to heal. Businesses reopened, streets buzzed with activity, and neighbors started talking to each other again. It wasn't perfect, there were still scars, but progress was undeniable. People smiled more, they laughed more, and they believed, perhaps for the first time, that things could get better. For the detective, seeing this transformation filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that exposing the truth wasn't just about clearing her name or punishing the guilty. It was about creating a future where no one else would have to endure what she went through. It was about making sure that justice wasn't just a word, it was a reality. And somewhere deep inside, she knew her fight was far from over. There were still battles to win, still voices to amplify, still wrongs to right. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had faced impossible odds and come out stronger on the other side. That alone was worth celebrating. Months had passed since the trial, and life in the small town was slowly finding its rhythm again. The chaos that once dominated headlines had settled into quieter conversations, discussions about rebuilding trust, holding leaders accountable, and ensuring something like this could never happen again. For the detective, though, the journey was far from over. Her story wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about healing wounds, both personal and communal. One crisp autumn morning, she received an invitation in the mail. It was a formal letter, printed on thick paper with an official seal at the top. The National Conference on Law Enforcement Transparency wanted her to speak at their annual event. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people made her stomach churn, but deep down she knew she couldn't say no. This was her chance to share what she'd learned, not just as a cop, but as someone who had stared corruption straight in the face and lived to tell the tale. The day of the conference arrived faster than she expected. Dressed in a simple yet professional outfit, she stood backstage, clutching her notes tightly. Her heart raced as she listened to the speaker before her wrap up his presentation. She could hear murmurs from the audience, feel the energy buzzing through the room. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her, bright and warm, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed. But then she looked out at the crowd. Rows upon rows of faces stared back at her, some curious, some skeptical, others hopeful. These were people who cared about justice, who wanted to make a difference. And suddenly she found her voice. "Hi, everyone," she began, her tone calm but steady. "I'm not here to give you answers or tell you how to fix everything. What I can do is share my story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire you to keep fighting for what's right." She went on to recount her experience. The late nights spent gathering evidence, the betrayal she felt when internal affairs turned against her, the fear of facing those corrupt officers in court. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She admitted how scared she had been, how close she came to giving up entirely. She talked about the toll it took on her mental health, the sleepless nights, the constant paranoia, the weight of knowing she was putting herself in danger every single day. But she also spoke about moments of hope, the quiet victories, the allies who stood by her side even when it seemed like the whole world was against her. Most importantly, she opened up about her relationship with her father. She thanked him publicly for the first time, acknowledging the role he played in helping her expose the truth. "My dad isn't perfect," she said, pausing to let the words sink in. "He missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones because he was busy doing his job. For years, I resented him for that. But during this ordeal, he showed me a side of himself I hadn't seen before. He reminded me that we're all human. We make mistakes, we hurt each other, but we can also come together to do incredible things. That's what we need to focus on, coming together." Her speech struck a chord with the audience. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging onto every word. Some nodded in agreement while others wiped away tears. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Reporters rushed to interview her afterward, asking if she planned to return to active duty. Smiling faintly, she shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "There's still work to be done outside the department. I want to focus on reforming the system so that no one else has to go through what I did." Back in the town where it all began, the impact of her efforts continued to unfold. New leadership had taken charge of the police department, bringing fresh ideas and stricter oversight. Officers underwent mandatory training sessions on ethics and accountability. Community meetings became regular occurrences, giving residents a platform to voice concerns directly to law enforcement. Slowly but surely, the gap between the police and the people they served started to close. Even Officer A and Officer B's absence left a void that forced others to step up. Younger officers, inspired by the detectives' bravery, vowed to do better. They formed support groups to discuss challenges they faced and brainstorm ways to improve transparency. One officer even started a mentorship program for kids in the community, hoping to break the cycle of mistrust and misunderstanding. For the detective, watching these changes unfold filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that real justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating opportunities for redemption and growth. It was about fostering understanding and empathy, even in the face of adversity. As winter approached, she decided to take a short vacation, a rare moment of rest after months of relentless work. She drove to a cabin nestled in the mountains, surrounded by towering trees and pristine snow. Sitting by the fireplace one evening, she reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the sacrifices she'd made, the risks she'd taken, and the lives she'd touched along the way. Despite everything, she felt hopeful. The scars would always remain, a reminder of battles fought and lessons learned, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. Justice might be messy, complicated, and imperfect, but it was worth fighting for. And somewhere deep inside, she knew her father was proud. Not because of her last name, but because of the woman she had become. The final chapter of this story unfolded months later, inside a federal courtroom far removed from the small-town drama where it all began. Officer A and Officer B, once untouchable figures in their department, now stood trial for crimes that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Stacks of documents, hours of surveillance footage, and testimonies from colleagues who finally found the courage to speak out. Even their own defense lawyers seemed to have given up hope, quietly urging them to accept plea deals rather than drag things out. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for seats alongside members of the community who had been directly affected by the corruption. Some victims sat quietly, clutching tissues as they prepared to hear justice served. Others wore determined expressions, refusing to let anger consume them. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the two officers but for everyone involved. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading the verdict. Officer A, the more senior of the two, was sentenced to 25 years without parole. His partner, Officer B, received 20 years. Both men listened with blank faces, betraying no emotion. When the gavel struck, sealing their fate, there wasn't a cheer or applause, just a collective exhale from the crowd. Justice had been delivered, not with fireworks but with quiet resolve. Afterward, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to comment. The detective avoided the spotlight, choosing instead to stand at the edge of the chaos, watching silently. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone spoke volumes. For many, she had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that, even when the odds seem impossible, standing up for what's right can make all the difference. As the media circus dispersed, she walked away unnoticed, disappearing into the crisp autumn air. Her father joined her moments later, falling into step beside her. They didn't speak much during the drive home, content to sit in comfortable silence. But when they arrived at the small diner where they used to meet as kids, he broke the quiet. "You did good," he said simply, sipping his coffee. "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." She smiled faintly, stirring sugar into her tea. "It's not over yet," she replied. "There's still so much work to do." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Fixing a broken system wasn't something that could happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and countless small victories along the way. But she was ready for the challenge. In fact, she thrived on it. Back in the town, life continued to transform. With new leadership came fresh ideas. The police department implemented stricter policies, including regular audits and anonymous tip lines for reporting misconduct. Officers underwent training programs focused on ethics, de-escalation tactics, and building trust with the community. Slowly but surely, the culture within the force shifted. People started seeing cops not as adversaries, but as partners in keeping the town safe. Community meetings became a cornerstone of this change. Residents gathered monthly to discuss concerns, share feedback, and collaborate with law enforcement. At first, these sessions were tense. Years of mistrust don't vanish overnight. But over time, genuine connections formed. Kids played basketball with officers in local parks. Parents shook hands with patrolmen, thanking them for their service. These moments may have seemed small, but together, they added up to something big. Hope. For the detective, this transformation was bittersweet. While she celebrated the progress, she also carried the weight of everything she'd lost. Friends distanced themselves during the trial, afraid of being associated with scandal. Relationships strained under the pressure of constant scrutiny. And though she rebuilt her bond with her father, there were still moments when she wondered if she'd paid too high a price for doing the right thing. But then she'd remember the faces. The young officer inspired to mentor kids, the victim, who finally felt heard, the neighbor who smiled warmly when passing her on the street. Those moments reminded her why she fought so hard. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating opportunities for healing and growth. It was about proving that even in the darkest times, people could come together to build something better. One evening, months after the sentencing, she returned to the cabin in the mountains. Snow covered the ground, muffling sound and casting everything in soft white light. Sitting by the fire, she pulled out a notebook and began writing. Not notes or reports this time, but reflections, her thoughts, fears, dreams. She wrote about the pain of betrayal and the joy of redemption. She documented lessons learned and hopes for the future. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Walking outside, she took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and battles to fight. But she was ready. Armed with experience, resilience, and an unshakable belief in justice, she knew she could face whatever came next. And as she stood there watching the sun rise over the mountains, she realized something profound. This wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning. There were still voices to amplify, wrongs to right, and lives to touch. Justice might be messy, complicated, and imperfect, but it was worth every ounce of effort. With that thought, she turned back toward the cabin, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.